He and his wife, Dina, and their 3 kids are very happily relocated to Tallahassee. They are enjoying the Jimbo Fisher era, and Skip says he intends for this to be his last move. Please, let's give a warm NEBA welcome to the moderator of today's forum.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. You know this is a highly anticipated event when Commissioner Lindley creates a whole new program just as an excuse to come here and watch the forum. So that was really inventive of her to do that. Of course, that's not true. Okay, so look, we're gonna, you know, what has been going on with the city's budget process is well chronicled. There are still some questions out there that I know a lot of you have. First, what I want to do is thank the 4 people that are here today from the commission. They don't have to be here, and I know Commissioner Maddox is at some national conference, and so I'm sure he would have been here as well. But this is, you know, this isn't a meeting that they have to do. This is something that they've chosen to do and accepted the invitation. And so we've got Mayor Andrew Gillum, Commissioner Nancy Miller, Commissioner Curtis Richardson, Commissioner Gil Ziffer, and let's just give them a big round of applause right now for being here. My job here is to keep things moving, is to make sure I've represented the questions that the group wants asked, and to see how much ground we can cover in the next 2.5 hours. 50 minutes. So first, there's some new news this morning about a Justice Department matching grant, partially matching grant, $1.8 million over 3 years. So I believe it's $600,000 per year, and the city has to kick in $400,000. Those are round numbers. My first question, just for the 4 of you, is show of hands. Did you know that that grant was in process before today or yesterday, or when you got the news that it was approved? Just, yes, I was aware. Okay, so that's interesting. So let's start, Mayor, with you. You knew that was going on. Is that, has that something that you thought was public and that everybody else knew? Obviously, your colleagues didn't know, and if that wasn't out, why wasn't it out?
Yeah. I'm not all the way sure why folks didn't know, but the city applies from time to time, actually pretty frequently throughout the government, throughout departments, for federal grant programs, state grant programs. I would probably argue 99% of the time we don't end up getting them. But on occasion, we get them, and I actually think this is a good news story. The fact that we may be able to draw down these federal dollars through the COPS program. Once those dollars are drawn down, what the typical process is for these grant opportunities that we get divulged down to us is that they come before the City Commission for a vote of acceptance of the terms. So in this case, the terms would be that we're going to, if we accept the grant, that we would put 25% toward the cost of those officers over the course of that 3-year grant process. There may be some other nuance, there's some other terms of the grant that would also have to be agreed to, that we're not supplanting positions that were already created, that these have to be folks who were previously either let go or positions that we didn't have and we needed. Some of you all recall that our police chief identified the need for, I believe it was 42 new officers. We knew we could not get all of that in a budget process. It would have been unreasonable to ask the public to sort of meet that goal. So we see this as a great opportunity to supplant and get us closer to what that needs assessment is for the department. So it's not atypical for the government to apply for grants and then the City Commission to vote to either accept the terms or reject the terms of the grant. So that's not unusual.
So that accept, reject is still down the line?
Precisely.
Okay. So we're going to get to how this impacts your meeting next week where you set a final rate, but I want to stay on this issue of kind of the communication of that within the city and then to the public. So Commissioner Miller, you did not raise your hand that you were aware this was in process. What is your reaction to the news as it relates to the budget process?
Well, as soon as I did hear yesterday about this, I sent back several questions, one of which was, does this count toward our 18 that we plan to hire this year and the 6 that we hired last year? Because last year they were only funded for a year. The answer was no, that this is to fulfill the 40, heading up toward the 42, this means 15 more officers, and that these people are solely, really, they're hired to do community-oriented policing. That's what they're specifically going to be hired to do. So that is the answer I got back, and then I sent back and said, when will the check arrive? Will this affect FY15, or is it coming next July so that we can put it in play for FY17? I'm sorry, will this affect FY16, or will it come into play in FY17? And I haven't heard back, and if you have the answer, you should tell me. It is over 3 years, and our match is 25%, and the terms of the grant also include that we will keep these folks employed an extra 12 months after the 3-year period is over.
Okay, so should you have known that this was in process, and should the public have known?
Well, I think it would have been nice if we had known, mainly because the only reason I wouldn't say tell the public is just what Mayor Gillum said. When we talked so much about the promise zone and we were trying to get that, as soon as we didn't get it, even though we didn't really expect to get it, then everybody said, well, there's something wrong with us that we didn't get it. So at that point, just as people, would you run around telling everybody what you were trying to, that you were trying to get these grants? So that's just the off-the-cuff answer to that question. On a number of grants, we don't really need constantly to be, somebody in water applies for a grant to get more money to put in new water lines. We don't necessarily need that information. The fact that the police officers, the number that was needed, certainly the PERP report, Mike Hines has been asking all summer why we haven't done another report to see how much staffing we have. All of this has been a hot topic in the public, as all of you know. And so for that reason, I do wish I would have preferred to have known that we had at least applied for this grant and that it was a possibility. Now, keep in mind that you can't budget based on possibility. When the subject of BP check came up, my answer was, until we know that we're going to get this next year or within the FY16, we can't use it. Now when we got it, then we can use it, and we did. So you can't really, I guess, count your chickens before they hatch.
Skip, can I also say, I absolutely agree that all of us should have been aware that this was an opportunity. And when I said earlier that I wasn't sure why they weren't, I really am not sure why the entire commission wasn't made aware that we were not only going after this grant, but we're also going after a grant on the body cameras from the federal government.
And we did know that. We did know the body camera grant, all of us did. We were very aware of that, mainly because we had to provide a 50% match. And if we had to be prepared to have that money available if we were to get this. So that's probably why that entered into the discussion in the way that it did.
Okay, Commissioner Richardson, if money from this grant was available in the upcoming fiscal year, the one we're talking about, how would that change your outlook on funding for law enforcement in the budget?
Well, first of all, Skip, I can just assume that this grant must have been submitted prior to my coming to the commission because I didn't know anything about it. And so that's the only reason I can give for it at this point. I don't know that it would have changed my position on supporting law enforcement and funding that in this year's budget because even though we're getting this grant, it's for 3 years, which means that it is non-recurring revenue. And we still will have to fund those positions. I mean, we're obligated, if we accept the grant, to fund those positions for that 4th year at least. But if we decide to continue those positions, we're going to have to find funding for those additional positions that will be funded out of the grant. that's above and beyond what we're talking about for next year's budget. The 18 officers that the chief requested and the 6 that were approved
Yeah, so
by the commission.
so let's say that just hypothetically, the grant could be used in the upcoming fiscal year. Houston, we have a problem. Why wouldn't that mean it's possible to defer some of the other expenditures on law enforcement or something else and maybe start that up 4 years from now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Did you understand anything I
Yes,
said?
I did. And that may be something that we look at, but we did not have that opportunity up until this point. I
Fair enough.
found out about this grant at 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon.
Okay.
So-
Well, is this working? Yeah. I certainly wish the communication had been better. This is clearly a subject that we have been talking about for several months when it comes to this being a public safety budget. And yeah, at the last minute, just a couple of days before we're going to vote on a millage increase and a budget, it came as a surprise to me that we were going to be getting some funding for these officers. So I, like my colleagues, had the same questions right away, which is, how does this affect our current budget? And whether the money, and I don't think it can, because the explanation I got is you can't use this towards any police officers that you had either planned or you actually already had on staff. So I think this is going to be an additional police officer available to us, which quite frankly is a very good thing, because we need police officers. And I'll come back to in a second, just something, for example, that I think we need to start talking about. But I am concerned because now we have, which is a good thing, more police officers, but as I understand it, that's salary, correct? So we have equipment, we have potentially vehicles, we have pension implications, there are all sorts of other things that are now impacted. So we need to have that figure in the next couple of days so that we can, because I've already been very clear, $500,000 is as much as I'll do. So we're gonna have to find whatever that is, those additional costs for budget year 16 somewhere else. And we need to know that very quickly. So yes, finding this out at the last minute is a little bothersome. I'm glad we have this available to us, but the communication within our government and out to the public, I think, needs to get better. Since the first time I came there, and some of my colleagues, Mayor, you and I have been there, we talked about transparency, and clearly we need to do a better job of being more transparent, but also within our government. So I think that's an area that we need to improve, and I know that's something clearly the media would like to see happen too.
Is there anybody who would consider not accepting the grant? Just asking the four of you. Anybody that would consider saying no?
For me, I need to know what the financial implications are for us on the short term in fiscal year 2016. And quite frankly, even though, I mean, we're going to commit to paying these police officers for the 1 year after the 3-year grant, but as my former colleague Commissioner Mushton would say, there's after that. There still is after that. And so we need to make sure that after that, we're not looking at another in my opinion, another millage rate increase. Then, for that, we need to live within our means.
Okay.
I would echo that. We really don't know the financial impact on the government and when. I mean, there will be a financial impact. And there has been a lot of give and take and back and forth about what to cut to get to the point where we have, at this point, ended up in the 0.5 mils. And so until, I mean, I have sent literally since yesterday at 4, been back and forth twice about with different questions. So until we actually know what the financial impact will be on the, at this point, on the FY16 budget, which is what we have to vote on Thursday, we're going to have to know that. Because it's going to take something, it's going to, as Commissioner Zipper said, it's going to take the 25%, and then it's going to take all of the other things that he mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, we need to know what the full roll-in cost is, but if we are committed to addressing what has been identified as the gap, roughly of a community policing department, federally the standards are that law enforcement would spend roughly 50% of their time responding to calls for services. That's you call 911, they get dispatched there in response. The other 50% of the time is intended to be spent on in the community. You're talking to folks, you're building relationships, you're patrolling, To the degree that there's traffic law enforcement, you would probably note that the City of Tallahassee PD has really reduced the need to, well, really, their enforcement there because of the concerns with regard to staffing within the department. So 50% is the standard for police departments. Here in the City of Tallahassee, our latest study indicates that our officers are spending roughly 86% of their time responding to calls. I don't know about you all, but certainly when I was younger, we knew the officer who was coming into the neighborhood. It would almost always be the same ones that were coming back. Ms. Jackson on the corner knew them. You know, my mom knew them, my grandmother knew them, because these were the folks who were in your rotation. And because of the demand, you got to give officers to wherever the call volume is coming in at. And that means in communities where, you know, crime may be a higher issue, you got folks, you know, young people, criminals and otherwise, who don't have a respect level, don't have a relationship. So it's not even a second thought to take a gun and pull the trigger on a law enforcement officer. That's dangerous for our law enforcement. It's dangerous for our community. It puts us in a really bad position, and we've got to do a better job at getting those ratios down. And so if we're committed to that, I can't think of one good reason why we wouldn't entertain bringing down some of the money that we sent to Washington, D.C. to address the problems that exist here at home for us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to read. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to read something from our interview, from the Democrats' interview with President Mangum at Florida A&M. She said, one of the things we did this year as part of our budget planning process is pull back 2 to 2.5% from all the units across campus and say to those departments, what are you going to do to enhance goals and objectives of the university that fit with the overall strategy? And depending on what they said, that money could be redistributed elsewhere. They could actually get more than their 2%. Commissioner Richardson, I want to ask you about this, because you talked about at the last meeting about concerns with the whole process. And is this the type of step that you would think would be appropriate moving forward for the city and maybe should have been done as a part of this cycle?
Well, believe it or not, it has been done. I've asked those questions. The manager, the budget staff have said every year, and this commission, prior to my coming, has overseen that. Each department is asked to reduce their budget. They were asked to do that this year. Maybe one of the others can say what the exact percentage was, but that ask is made every year. So we are doing that. I think that, and what my suggestion was, is that we be involved in the process a little sooner and a little more often. When I was on the school board, we were involved in the budget setting process from start to finish and every step along the way. So we weren't surprised when it came to the final budget hearing or the last 2 or 3 budget hearings that we had. And we also had a citizens committee that helped our staff to fashion the budget. So we had community input that way, and they could go out and inform the public about what the budget process was and how we were putting that budget together for the school district. And so I've suggested that we consider that for the city and have more public input into the process, and we have more involvement in the budget setting process.
Commissioner Ziffer, are you satisfied with the information you've gotten from city staff as it pertains to this budget?
No. No, I mean, I'm not. We're now, we directed staff to identify additional cuts for us to have for us for this Thursday. And I saw a brief list of which all of them seemed acceptable to me. And we'll talk about that on Thursday. But they were there before. They didn't magically appear. And so, no, I'll be blunt. I think, and some of you may disagree with me, but we recently had a pretty broad discussion before our commission over several different meetings between Yellow Cab and Uber. And whether you like Uber or not, or whether you love Yellow Cab or not, the fact of the matter is there's a new way young people and other folks want a service to pick them up and take them somewhere. And it's done through an app. It's very different. But the fact of the matter is, in many cases, it's cheaper for the person that's using it. It's quicker. Their response is better. You get more information on who's driving you around. And it's a different way of doing things. And I think government overall, not just our government, I think any government, there's an opportunity for us to have a very, very different view of how we do some things. So when we look at our budget, there may not have been opportunities to save as much as maybe some of us in this room would have liked to have seen. But I think if we take a very drastic look at the way we do things overall, there's probably additional savings for us. And I think we'll start to get into that process. At least I'd like to hope so.
Commissioner Miller, could you talk about the overtime line in this budget? Roughly last fiscal year, 7-point-something million. It looks like we're on pace to spend somewhere a little over 8 million. In the current fiscal year, there was 9.2 million budgeted, so coming in under budget. And then it's roughly 9.4, forgive me if I'm off a little bit on those numbers, in the current budget year. With the adding of new positions, why wouldn't that be an opportunity to decrease overtime?
Well, hopefully it will, but keep in mind, the general fund is separate from all the utilities, so all of them are off the table, because I guarantee you, everybody in the room, when you're sitting in the dark, you really want somebody out there, even if it's on overtime, fixing those lines to get that power on back to your house. And same way with water, same way with you have a sewage backup, whatever it is. So we take the utilities off the table, and we just go to the general fund. 89%, I hate to be so nerdy, but you know, according to our staff, 89% of that overtime has to do with the Parks and Rec Department. So I agree that we should be more aware and looking at all of this to see if we can probably do a lot better on the overtime. I especially am interested in the number of staff people that we have out at night at public meetings. We use these as a public information session whenever there's a public meeting anywhere, just about. But one of the reasons we didn't have budget hearings this year is that last year it was so incredibly labor intensive on staff, and one of the budget hearings I went to last year, there were 18 residents and probably 100 staff people. So I think we can definitely find ways to approach things like that better. If we're having a public meeting, the people that need to be there to address the needs that are going to be discussed would be the ones that need to be on site, and maybe not so much everybody else.
Okay, so Mr. Mayor, I know you want to say something here, but
Yeah.
I think I just heard Commissioner Miller say that 90% of the overtime expenditure from the city comes from Parks and Rec. Did I hear that?
The overwhelming majority of if you take police off the table, which is the overwhelming majority, what is left on the table, Parks and Recreation being a major driver. But I want to qualify that, because we have folks in Parks and Recreation who spend 30 hours a week, maybe more, in fact, on the job. We are, and I can't say that I'm completely comfortable with this, by the way, but instead of offering full-time position, FTE positions that you have to pay retirement, that you have to give benefits to, our city department, our government has decided that we would use overtime as a means of not having to make full-time employee hires. Get this clear, if we were to convert away from the overtime expense in these areas and hired people to go in them full-time, we would be talking about a substantially much larger number of individuals having to be hired into this government, receiving benefits, so on and so forth. So the government has used overtime, frankly, as a strategy for not hiring full-time employees. And again, I'm not endorsing or subtracting, my position on that, just trying to lay the fact bare that it's a means of not incurring full-time employee costs.
Yeah, so I guess where some clarification would be helpful is, since the strategy in this next budget is to add full-time employees, wouldn't there be a commensurate reduction in overtime? And what has changed since just last fiscal year, so 11.5 months ago, where we were able to do it with 7-point-something million in overtime, that we wouldn't be able to do that in the next fiscal year? Commissioner Miller, looks like you're anxious to respond.
The first thing that I wanted to talk about was those FTEs, and when the budget hawks came up, they said, why not hire the 4.75 employees? Well, first of all, it's 3.75 employees. So why do we have 7.75 of an employee? It is the support person for the ethics officer. And basically, the city doesn't have a choice when there's a need like that because of the referendum. The referendum basically gives the ethics board the prerogative of asking for what they need from the city, and we are to comply. So that person, that 0.75, is that person. And then I think we had a death in the treasurer clerk's office, which left a vacancy. One of them is that. We had the animal shelter foster care person who probably saves more money than she costs. She was funded, I believe, by a grant, and she was no longer going to be there. That's another one. And then, gosh, I'm trying to remember who the third one was. The horticulturist at Cascades Park. When in the beginning, the staff asked for 9 people to care for Cascades Park. They got 4, and that means that they're pulling people off of the other parks in the city to take care of Cascades Park. When a blueprint project is finished, it is turned over to the entity that has jurisdiction, which happens to be, in this case, be the city. And we can take that park that has turned into a major, I mean, it just most recently was selected the Public Works Project of the Year for 2015 by the American Public Works Association. This is an unbelievable marriage of stormwater retention and parks. So it's an asset. Do we want to take care of the asset, or we just want to let the weeds grow up? And we chose that we probably need to have at least one person over there.
I want to ask about this video that came out. I want to ask you, Mr. Mayor, about this because you were the only one that we were not able to get a comment from in the paper, the video that the city produced. What was your, I just want to get your reaction to that.
I'm glad I missed the email chain on that one. You know, my criticism is that a video that brings the public into greater awareness around how the city budget works should have been out there a long time ago. There are other folks, entities, individuals that are doing the job of educating the public from their perspective. I don't think we should be propagandizing. I don't think we should be telling people that the commission is right to take a vote to increase ad valorem or decrease ad valorem. I think we ought to be in the business of saying, this is how much money we collect. This is how your money gets used, and then this is the deficit. I mean, my question to the room, and I know I'm not entitled to ask one, and I'm not actually asking you to solve the problems that we're necessarily elected to address, but by a quick show of hands and your most honest sentiment, how many of us believe that off of your ad valorem taxes, which is the major tax that communities collect, how many of you believe that ad valorem taxes should at the very least pay for public safety? At the very least should pay for public safety. Well, in our community, and unfortunately we've got roughly half the land in this city off the tax roll, but those of us who live within the 106 square miles of the city of Tallahassee, and we pay our ad valorem taxes, we generate, the difference between the cost of our police department and what we generate on ad valorem alone. That's before you get to roads, before you get to parks, before you get to anything else that the government does. There's about an $18.8 million deficiency between that. And so I would just say, in order to have some sympathy or even at least acknowledgement of the problem we enter into before we get to any other disaggregation of the budget, that's where we start. That's where the problem begins. And so to your question of whether we're inflexible about what to do on ad valorem, I'm not inflexible. I don't think any of us are inflexible on that, but what has to be tended to for me first is that we don't use one-time money to solve sustainable long-term problems. And second, that whatever we do this year ought to buy us enough time that we're not back at this conversation next year and the year after that and the year after that. It's not fair to you all in the public, and it's not fair to us as policymakers to throw us into this level of indecision, this level of compromise every single budget cycle. You don't know what you're going to be paying, therefore you can't make an appropriate budget, and we don't know what we're going to be getting, so we can't make an appropriate budget.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay, we got about 15 minutes left. I want to maybe go into a semi-speed round here because there's a lot of questions we want to get through. First is lobbying contracts, $40,000 increase. I just want to go down the line quickly and say, is this something you support, and what's the justification for it?
I'll start by saying that the $240 can't remember, $220,000 for our collective lobbying contracts was the number we originally went out to contract to bid when we opened up the last lobbying contract. So the numbers that are in the budget went back to what that original number was the last time we went out to bid. We're due to rebid again. And so that number is kept the same. I'm actually quite fine with, if we get the bids, you know, driving those numbers down, getting a cheaper deal, but it's not like there is a $40,000 increase necessarily. That number has never come down since the point at which we bid. We just didn't spend it. So it was in the budget and then swept into deficiencies, but the amount, the 220, actually is not an increase on the budget line. It's been there. We just didn't spend it.
Okay, so would you be in favor of budgeting to spend what was actually spent versus the budgeted amount? I mean, you know, I love trying that with my people. My bosses is budgeting versus prior year budget instead of versus actual. They usually don't buy it.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, so that's a potential reduction there. The $9 million in the solid waste account, could you talk about that, Commissioner Miller?
I would love to talk about that. You know, we can, and on my way over here, I have to tell you, my CPA was literally constantly texting me about this topic. And the thing about a reserve fund, or the thing about an excess or a deficit, is that whatever we do with that reserve fund, who knows where we'll be next year? And are we going next year to go, if we use it this year, which doesn't look good to our bonding agencies, if we use it this year, what are we going to do next year when they expect to have deficits? They are running, and I'd love to know why this is, but since we've been concentrating on this year's budget instead of tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, I've been studying up on this one. But they have told me, the staff in utilities has told me that they expect to have deficits in the coming years because they're going to need to be buying equipment, primarily solid waste vehicles to continue to do their jobs. We have, as you may know, we took the suggestion of putting off the vehicle replacement for a year, and maybe we'll have a little bit less of a deficit next year. But the fact is that these reserves in the utilities, they go up and they go down. Like when I first came into office, we had an $8 million overage or excess in the electric fund. The next year we had an $8 million deficit. And we can't spend that and then come back to you next year when the deficit is there and say, well, okay, everybody's going to have to be assessed a certain little bit of money to help make up this deficit. So that's how those reserves work. If there weren't any reserves like that, and I hope you as business people, when I had a business, I did exactly the same thing. On the good years, we put money away to make sure, in fact, we were commissioned, and so there was a huge gap between 1 month and the next, and maybe 1 year and the next, totally dependent on weather or things outside our control. And so you can't just spend every time you have an excess. That excess, and I know I'm going on, I'm sorry, but one of the reasons we have that in solid waste is because they have really, really worked hard to contain their costs.
Commissioner Zipper, looks like you want to weigh in on that, and then Commissioner Richardson.
I want to reinforce what the mayor said, because he's absolutely right. And that is, we do not want to come back next year or the year after or the year after that and go through this exercise again. Do any of you want to come back and do this again? Don't you have other things to do? Because I know I do. So the fact of the matter is that we are trying to be as responsible as we can for the out years. Now, Commissioner Miller is right. We do have some expenses coming up in solid waste where we need to use those reserve funds. The fact of the matter is, for the last several years, we have not raised ad valorem taxes. I have talked to my colleagues around the state. They have incrementally been going up. We kept drawing from this bucket and that bucket and drew here and drew there, and we probably should not have been doing that. We probably should have incrementally been raising them so that it wasn't this 27%, now 13% shock. Maybe we didn't do our jobs. What we tried to do is keep taxes down for everybody during a very difficult time. But the rubber's hitting the road now, and we've got to do something so that we're responsible. Now, are there more savings? Probably. Will we find them? We're going to keep looking. But we need to be responsible and vote and approve something so that we're not back in following years, because nobody wants to do this again.
So Commissioner Richardson, I've gotten away from you here. You're you've turned into the Mike
I'm the
Huckabee
new-
of the debate here that's disappeared. But so we've talked about a lot of things here. I want to just get you weigh in. We've talked about the video, the solid waste fund, some other things. I want to get your view on those.
Well, the video I thought was it should have happened a long time ago. I said that. I've said all along that we have done a very poor job of educating the public about what the city has done up to this point. As Commissioner Ziffer mentioned, our millage rate has not been raised in 12 years. So anybody who's been on the commission during that time can honestly say they've never voted for a property tax increase in the city of Tallahassee because one has never been proposed. And so the staff and the manager have done, I think, a tremendous job in that respect. I was in St. Petersburg recently. Their millage rate is 12 mills. The city of St. Petersburg, 12 mills. And, you know, ours is 3.7, guys. But we have not done a good job of educating the public, of including the public in our budget process, and that we've certainly got to do a better job. And I think the video factually tells the story. It's not propaganda, but it factually tells the story, and I think it's a good thing.
I also want to ask you about the negotiations with the police and fire unions. A lot of the expense in the budget is tied back to that negotiation. In particular, the increased pension for the police department. In retrospect, do you think that the city was as diligent in those negotiations as it should have been?
Well, I mean, I think we were. We were all at the table at the same time. Skip, I mean, it's easy for you to, you know, second guess yourself, if you will, but we felt that we did the best job that we could while we were at the negotiating table with our first responders. You know, we certainly want to make sure that we are able to keep people on board that serve this community in those roles, that they're not looking to go other places to make more money, and in some instances they do. But certainly that's something that we're going to always keep an eye on as we go forward. But I think we did the best job that we could during those negotiations during this time around.
I want to, again, thank you for taking this time to be here today. It is, you know, these aren't always easy questions to answer, and I appreciate y'all taking the time, and I hope you'll recognize them for doing that right now.